Skeleton Men of Jupiter by Edgar Burroughs. Read by Joe DeNoia, Chesterfield, New Jersey, April 17th, 2024. Forward. Particularly disliking forwards, I seldom read them. Yet it seems that I scarcely ever write a story that I do not inflict a forward on my long-suffering readers. Occasionally, I also have to inject a little weather and scenery in my deathless classics. Two further examples of literary racketeering that I especially deplore in the writings of others. Yet there is something to be said in extenuation of weather and scenery, which, together with adjectives, do much to lighten the burdens of authors and run up their word count. Still, there is little excuse for forwards, and if this were my story, there would be none. However, it is not my story. It is John Carter's story. I am merely his amanuensis. On guard, John Carter takes his sword in hand. Edgar Rice Burroughs. End of forward. Chapter 1. Betrayed. I am no scientist. I am a fighting man. My most beloved weapon is the sword. And during a long life, I have seen no reason to alter my theories as to its proper application to the many problems with which I had been faced. That is not true of the scientists. They are constantly abandoning one theory for another one. The law of gravitation is about the only theory that is held throughout my lifetime. And if the Earth should suddenly start rotating 17 times faster than it does now, even the law of gravitation would fail us, and we would all go sailing off into space. Theories come and theories go. Scientific theories. I recall that there was once a theory that time and space moved forward constantly in a straight line. There was also the theory that neither time nor space existed. It was all in your mind's eye. Then came the theory that time and space curved in upon themselves. Tomorrow, some scientist may show us reams and reams of paper and hundreds of square feet of blackboard covered with equations, formulae, signs, symbols, and diagrams to prove that time and space curve out away from themselves. Then our theoretical universe will come tumbling about our ears, and we shall have to start all over again from scratch. Like many fighting men, I'm inclined to be credulous concerning matters outside my vocation. Or at least I used to be. I believed whatever the scientists said. Long ago, I believed with Flammarion that Mars was habitable and inhabited. Then a newer and more reputable school of scientists convinced me that it was neither. Without losing hope, I was yet forced to believe them until I came to Mars to live. They still insist that Mars is neither habitable or inhabited. But I live here. Fact and theory seem to be opposed. Unquestionably, the scientists appear to be correct in theory. Equally incontrovertible is it that I am correct in fact. In the adventure that I am about to narrate, fact and theory will again cross swords. I hate to do this to my long-suffering scientific friends, but if they would only consult me first, rather than dogmatically postulating theories which do not meet with popular acclaim, they would save themselves much embarrassment. Deja Thoris, my incomparable princess, and I were sitting upon a carved ursite bench in one of the gardens of our palace in Lesser Helium, when an officer in the leather of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium, approached and saluted. From Tardos Moors to John Carter. Kayor, he said. The Jedak requests your immediate presence in the Hall of Jedaks, in the Imperial Palace in Greater Helium. At once, I replied. May I fly you over, sir? He asked. I came in a two-seater. Thanks, I replied. I'll join you at the hangar in a moment. He saluted and left us. Who was he? Asked Savators. I don't recall ever having seen him before. Probably one of the new officers from Zor, whom Tardos Moors has commissioned in the Jedak's Guard. It was a gesture of his, made to assure Zor that he has the utmost confidence in the loyalty of that city, and as a measure for healing old wounds. Zor, which lies about 380 miles southeast of Helium, is one of the most recent conquests of Helium, and had given us a great deal of trouble in the past because of treasonable acts instigated by a branch of its royal family, led by one Multis Par, a prince. About 5 years before the events I'm about to narrate occurred, this Multis Par had disappeared, and since then, Zor had given us no trouble. No one knew what had become of the man, and it was supposed that he had either taken the last long voyage down the river Is to the Lost Sea of Course in the Valley Dor, or had been captured and murdered by members of some horde of savage green men. Nor did anyone appear to care, just so he never returned to Zor, where he was thoroughly hated for his arrogance and cruelty. I hope that my revered grandfather does not keep you long, said Savators. We are having a few guests for dinner tonight, and I do not wish you to be late. A few, I said. How many? 200 or 300? Don't be impossible, she said, laughing. Really, only a few. 1,000, if it please you, my dear, I assured her as I kissed her. And now, goodbye. I'll doubtless be back within the hour. That was a year ago. As I ran up the ramp toward the hangar on the palace roof, I had, for some then unaccountable reason, a sense of impending ill. But I attributed it to the fact that my tete-a-tete with my princess had been so quickly interrupted. The thin air of dying Mars renders the transition from day to night startlingly sudden to an Earthman. Twilight is of a short duration owing to the negligible refraction of the sun's rays. When I had left Savators, the sun, though low, was still shining. The garden was in shadow, but it was still daylight. Then I stepped from the head of the ramp to that part of the roof of the palace where the hangar was located, which housed the private flyers of the family. Dim twilight partially obscuring my vision. It would soon be dark. I wondered why the hangar guard had not switched on the lights. In the very instant that I realized that something was amiss, a score of men surrounded and overpowered me before I could draw and defend myself. A voice cautioned me to silence. It was the voice of the man who had summoned me into this trap. When the other spoke, it was in a language I had never heard before. They spoke in a dismal, hollow monotone, expressionless, sepulchral. They had thrown me face down upon the pavement and trussed my wrists behind my back. Then they jerked me roughly to my feet. Now, for the first time, I obtained a fairly good sight of my captors. I was appalled. I could not believe my own eyes. These things were not men. They were human skeletons. Black eye sockets looked out from grinning skulls. Bony, skeletal fingers grasped my arms. It seemed to me that I could see every bone in each body. Yet the things were alive. They moved. They spoke. They dragged me toward a strange craft that I had not before noticed. It lay in the shadow of the hangar. Long, lean, sinister. It looked like an enormous projectile, with rounded nose and tapering tail. In the first brief glance I had of it, I saw fins forward below its median line. A long, longitudinal aileron, or so I judged it to be, running almost the full length of the ship, and strangely designed elevator and rudder as part of the appendage assembly. I saw no propellers. But then I had little time for close examination of the strange craft, as I was quickly hustled through a doorway in its metal side. The interior was pitch dark. I could see nothing other than the faint light of the dying day visible through long, narrow portholes in the ship's side. The man who had betrayed me followed me into the ship with my captors. The door was closed and securely fastened. Then the ship rose silently into the night. No light showed upon it, within or without. However, I was certain that one of our patrol ships must have seen it. Then, if nothing more, my people would have a clue upon which to account for my disappearance. And before dawn, 1,000 ships of the Navy of Helium would be scouring the surface of Barsoom, and the air above it, in search of me. Nor could any ship the size of this find hiding place wherein to elude them. Once above the city, the lights of which I could see below us, the craft shot away at appalling speed. Nothing upon Barsoom could have hoped to overhaul it. It moved at great speed and in utter silence. The cabin lights were switched on. I was disarmed, and my hands were freed. I looked with revulsion, almost with horror, upon the 20 or 30 creatures which surrounded me. I saw now that they were not skeletons, though they still closely resembled the naked bones of dead men. Parchment-like skin was stretched tightly over the bony structure of the skull. There seemed to be neither cartilage nor fat underlying it. What I had thought were hollow eye sockets were deep-set brown eyes showing no whites. The skin of the face merged with what should have been gums at the roots of the teeth, which were fully exposed in both jaws, precisely as are the teeth of a naked skull. The nose was but a gaping hole in the center of the face. There were no external ears, only the orifices. Nor was there any hair upon any of the exposed parts of their bodies, nor upon their heads. The things were even more hideous than the hideous Calcanes of Bantoom, those horrifying spider-men into whose toils fell Tara of Helium during that adventure which led her to the country of the chessmen of Mars. They, at least, had beautiful bodies, even though they were not their own. The bodies of my captors harmonized perfectly with their heads. Parchment-like skin covered the bones of their limbs so tightly that it was difficult to convince oneself that it was not true bone that was exposed. And so tightly was this skin drawn over their torsos that every rib and every vertebrae stood out in plain and disgusting relief. When they stood directly in front of a bright light, I could see their internal organs. They wore no clothing other than a G-string. Their harness was quite similar to that which we Barsoomians wear, which is not at all remarkable, since it was designed to serve the same purpose, supporting a sword, a dagger, and a pocket pouch. Disgusted, I turned away from them to look down upon the moon-bathed surface of my beloved Mars. But where was it? Close to port was Chloros, the farther moon. I caught a glimpse of its surface as we flashed by. 14,500 miles in little more than a minute. It was incredible. The red man who had engineered my capture came and sat down beside me. His rather handsome face was sad. "I am sorry, John Carter," he said. "Perhaps, if you will permit me to explain, you will at least understand why I did it. I do not expect that you will ever forgive me." "Where is this ship taking me?" I demanded. "To Sassoom," he said. Sassoom? That is the Barsoomian name for Jupiter, 342 million miles from the place where my Dejathors awaited me. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Udon. For some time I sat in silence, gazing out in the inky black void of space. A Stygian backdrop against which stars and planets shone with intense brilliancy, steady and untwinkling. To port or starboard, above, below, the heavens stared at me with unblinking eyes. Millions of white-hot, penetrating eyes. Many questions harassed my mind. Had I been especially signaled out for capture? If so, why? How had this large ship been able to enter helium and settle upon my landing stage in broad daylight? Who was this sad-faced, apologetic man who had led me into such a trap? He could have nothing against me personally. Never, before he stepped into my garden, had I seen him. It was he who broke the silence. It was as though he had read my thoughts. "You wonder why you are here, John Carter," he said. "If you will bear with me, I shall tell you. In the first place, let me introduce myself. I am Udon, formerly a Padwar in the guard of Zutith, the Jet of Zor, who was killed in battle when Helium overthrew his tyrannical reign and annexed the city. My sympathies were all upon the side of Helium, and I saw a brilliant and happy future for my beloved city once she was part of a great Heliumatic empire. I fought against Helium, because it was my sworn duty to defend the Jet I loathed, a monster of tyranny and cruelty. But when the war was over, I gladly swore allegiance to Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. I had been raised in the palace of the Jed in utmost intimacy with the members of the royal family. I knew them all well, especially Moltes Par, the prince, who, in the natural course of events, would have succeeded to the throne. He was of a kind with his father, Zutith. Arrogant, cruel, tyrannical by nature. After the fall of Zor, he sought to foment discord and arouse the people to revolt. When he failed, he disappeared. That was about 5 years ago. Another member of the royal family, whom I knew well, who was as unlike Zutith and Moltes Par as day is unlike night. Her name is Vaja. She is a cousin of Multispar. I loved her, and she loved me. We were to have been married when, about 2 years after the disappearance of Multispar, Vaja mysteriously disappeared. I did not understand why he was telling me all this. I was certainly not interested in his love affairs. I was not interested in him. I was still less interested, if possible, in Multispar. But I listened. I searched, he continued. The governor of Zor gave me every assistance within his power, but all to no avail. Then, one night, Multispar entered my quarters when I was alone. He wasted no time. He came directly to the point. I suppose, he said, that you are wondering what has become of Vaja. I knew then that he had been instrumental in her abduction, and I feared the worst, for I knew the type of man he was. I whipped out my sword. Where is she? I demanded. Tell me if you care to live. He only laughed at me. Don't be a fool, he said. If you kill me, you will never see her again. You will never even know where she is. Work with me, and you may have her back. But you will have to work fast, as I am becoming very fond of her. It is odd, he added reminiscently, that I could have lived for years in the same palace with her, and have been blind to her many charms, both mental and physical, especially physical. Where is she? I demanded. If you have harmed her, you beast. Don't call me names, Udon, he said. If you annoy me too greatly, I may keep her for myself and enlist the services of someone other than you to assist me with the plan I had come to explain to you. I thought you would be more sensible. You used to be a very sensible man. But then, of course, love plays strange tricks upon one's mental processes. I am commencing to find that out in my own case. He gave a nasty little laugh. But don't worry, he continued. She is quite safe. So far. How much longer she will be safe depends wholly upon you. Where is she? I demanded. Where you can never get her without my help, he replied. If she is anywhere upon all Barsoom, I shall find her, I said. She is not on Barsoom. She is on Sassoom. You lie, Multispar, I said. He shrugged indifferently. Perhaps you will believe her, he said, and he handed me a letter. It was indeed from Vaja. I recall its message word for word. Incredible as it may seem to you, I am a prisoner on Sassoom. Multispar has promised to bring you here to me if you will perform what he calls a small favor for him. I do not know what he's going to ask of you, but unless it can be honorably done, do not do it. I am safe and unharmed. What is it you wish me to do? I asked. I shall not attempt to quote his exact words, but this, in effect, is what he told me. Multispar's disappearance from Zor was caused by his capture from men from Sassoom. For some time they have been coming to this planet, reconnoitering, having in mind the eventual conquest of Barsoom. I asked him for what reason, and he explained that it was simply because they were a warlike race. Their every thought was of war, as it had been for ages, until the warlike spirit was as compelling as the urge for self-preservation. They had conquered all other peoples upon Sassoom, and sought a new world to conquer. They had captured him to learn what they could of the armaments and military effectiveness of various Barsoomian nations, and had decided that as helium was the most powerful, it would be helium upon which they would descend. Helium once disposed of, the rest of Barsoom would, they assume, be easy to conquer. "And where do I come into this scheme of theirs?" I asked. "I am coming to that," said Udon. "The Morgors are a thoroughgoing and efficient people. They neglect no littlest detail which might affect the success or failure of a campaign. They already have excellent maps of Barsoom and considerable data relative to the fleets and armaments of the principal nations. They now wish to check this data and obtain full information as to the war techniques of the Heliumites. This they expect to get from you. This they will get from you." I smiled. "Neither they nor you rate the honor and loyalty of a Heliumite very highly." A sad smile crossed his lips. "I know how you feel," he said. "I felt the same way, until they captured Vaja, and her life became the price of my acquiescence. Only to save her did I agree to act as a decoy to aid in your capture. The Morgors are adepts in individual and mass psychology, as well as in the art of war." "These things are Morgors?" I asked, nodding in the direction of some of the repulsive creatures. Udon nodded. "I can appreciate the position in which you have been placed," I said. "But the Morgors have no such hold on me." "Wait," said Udon. "What do you mean?" I demanded. "Just wait. They will find a way. They are fiends. No one could have convinced me, before Multispar came to me with this proposition, that I could have been forced to betray a man whom I, with all decent men, admire as I have admired you, John Carter. Perhaps I was wrong, but when I learned that Vaja would be tortured and mutilated after Multispar had had his way with her, and even then not be allowed to die, but kept for future torture, I weakened and gave in. I do not expect you to forgive me, but I hope that you will understand." "I do understand," I said. "Perhaps, under like circumstances, I should have done the same thing." I could see how terribly the man's conscience tortured him. I could see that he was essentially a man of honor. I could forgive him for the thing he had done for an innocent creature whom he loved. But could he expect me to betray my country? Betray my whole world? To save a woman I had never seen? Still, I was bothered. Frankly, I did not know what I should do when faced with the final decision. "At least," I said, "should I ever be situated as you were, I could appear to comply while secretly working to defeat their ends." "It was thus that I thought," he said. "It is still the final shred by which I cling to my self-respect. Perhaps, before it is too late, I may still be able to save both Vaja and yourself." "Perhaps we can work together to that end, and to the salvation of Helium," I said. "Though I am really not greatly worried about Helium. I think she can take care of herself." He shook his head. "Not if a part, even, of what Multispar has told me is true. They will come in thousands of these ships, invisible to the inhabitants of Barsoom. Perhaps 2 million of them will invade Helium and overrun her 2 principal cities before a single inhabitant is aware that a single enemy threatens their security. They will come with lethal weapons of which Barsoomians know nothing, and which they cannot, therefore, combat. Invisible ships, I exclaimed. Why, I saw this one plainly after I was captured. Yes, he said. It was not invisible then, but it was invisible when it came in broad daylight under the bows of your patrol ships and landed in one of your most prominent places in all Lesser Helium. It was not invisible when you first saw it, because it had cast off its invisibility. Or, rather, the Morgors had cast it off, so that they might find it again themselves. For otherwise, it would have been as invisible to them as to us. Do you know how they achieve this invisibility? I asked. Multis Par has explained it to me, replied Udon. Let me see. I am not much of a scientist, but I think that I recall more or less correctly what he told me. It seems that on some of the ocean beaches of Sassoom, there is a submicroscopic magnetic sand composed of prismatic crystals. When the Morgors desire invisibility for a ship, they magnetize the hull. And then, from countless tiny apertures in the hull, they coat the whole exterior of the ship with these prismatic crystals. They simply spray them out, and they settle in a cloud upon the hull, causing light rays to bend around the ship. The instant that the hull is demagnetized, these tiny particles, light as air, fall or are blown off. And instantly, the ship is visible again. Here, a Morgor approached and interrupted our conversation. His manner was arrogant and rude. I could not understand his words, as he spoke his own language in the hollow, graveyard tones I had previously noticed. Udon replied in the same language, but in a less lugubrious tone of voice. Then he turned to me. Your education is to commence at once, he said, with a wry smile. What do you mean? I asked. During this voyage, you are to learn the language of the Morgors, he explained. How long is the voyage going to last? I asked. It takes about 3 months to learn a language well enough to understand, and make yourself understood. The voyage will take about 18 days, as we shall have to make a detour of some 1,000,000 miles to avoid the asteroids. They happen to lie directly in our way. I am supposed to learn their language in 18 days? I asked. You are not only supposed to, but you will, replied Udon. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Morgors of Sassoom. My education commenced. It was inconceivably brutal, but most effective. My instructors worked on me in relays, scarcely giving me time to eat or sleep. Udon assisted as interpreter, which was immensely helpful to me, as was the fact that I am exceedingly quick in picking up new languages. Sometimes I was so overcome by lack of sleep that my brain lagged, and my responses were slow and inaccurate. Upon one such occasion, the Morgor who was instructing me slapped my face. I had put up with everything else because I was so very anxious to learn their language. A vital necessity if I were ever to hope to cope with them and thwart their fantastic plan of conquest. But I cannot put up with that. I hit the fellow a single blow that sent him entirely across the cabin. But I almost broke my hand against his unpadded, bony jaw. He did not get up. He lay where he had fallen. Several of his fellows came for me with drawn swords. The situation looked bad, as I was unarmed. Udon was appalled. Fortunately for me, the officer in command of the ship had been attracted by the commotion and appeared at the scene of the action in time to call his men off. He demanded an explanation. I had now mastered sufficient words of their language so that I could understand almost everything that was said to me, and make myself understood by them, after a fashion. I told the fellow that I had been starved and deprived of sleep, and did not complain, but that no man could strike me without suffering the consequences. That no creature of a lower order may strike a Morgor without suffering the consequences, he replied. What are you going to do about it? I asked. I am going to do nothing, he replied. My orders require me to bring you alive to Erebus. When I have done that and reported your behavior, it will lie wholly within the discretion of Bandolian as to what your punishment shall be. Then he walked away, but food was brought me and I was allowed to sleep. Nor did another Morgor strike me during the remainder of the voyage. While I was eating, I asked Udon what Erebus was. It is the name for the planet Sassoom, he replied. And who is Bandolian? Well, I suppose he would be called a Jeddak on Barsoom. I judge this from the numerous references I have heard them make concerning him. Anyhow, he seems to be an object of fear, if not veneration. After a long sleep, I was much refreshed. Everything that I had been taught was clear again in my mind, no longer dulled by exhaustion. It was then that the commander took it upon himself to examine me personally. I'm quite sure that he did so for the sole purposes of finding fault with me, and perhaps punishing me. He was extremely nasty and arrogant. His simplest questions were at first couched in sarcastic language. But finally, evidently disappointed, he left me. I was given no more instruction. You have done well, said Udon. You have, in a very short time, mastered their language well enough to suit them. This was the 15th day. During the last 3 days, they left me alone. Traveling through space is stupefyingly monotonous. I had scarcely glanced from the portholes for days. This was, however, principally because my time was constantly devoted to instruction. But now, with nothing else to do, I glanced out. A most gorgeous scene presented itself to my astonished eyes. Gorgeous Jupiter loomed before me in all his majestic immensity. 5 of his moons were plainly visible in the heavens. I could see the tiny one closest to him, which is only 30 miles in diameter. During the ensuing 2 days, I saw, or at least I thought I saw, all of the remaining 5 moons, and Jupiter grew larger and more imposing. We were approaching him at the very considerable speed of 23 miles per second, but were still some 2 million miles distant. Freed from the monotony of language lessons, my mind was once more enslaved to my curiosity. How could life exist upon a planet which one school of scientific thought claimed to have a surface temperature of 260 degrees below zero, and which another school was equally positive was still in a half-molten condition, and so hot that gases rose as hot vapor into the thick, warm atmosphere to fall as incessant rain? How could human life exist in an atmosphere made up largely of ammonia and methane gases? And what of the effect of the planet's terrific gravitational pull? Would my legs be able to support my weight? If I fell down, would I be able to rise again? Another question which presented itself to my mind related to the motive power, which had been carrying us through space at terrific speeds for 17 days. I asked Udon if he knew. They utilized the 8th Barsoomian ray, which we know of as the ray of propulsion, in combination with the highly concentrated gravitational forces of all celestial bodies, within the range of whose attraction the ship passes. And a concentration of ray L, cosmic rays, which are collected from space and discharged at high velocities from propulsion tubes at the ship's stern. The 8th Barsoomian ray helps to give the ship initial velocity upon leaving a planet, and as a brake to its terrific speed when approaching its landing upon another. Gravitational forces are utilized both to accelerate speed and to guide the ship. The secret of their success with these interplanetary ships lies in the ingenious methods they have developed for concentrating these various forces and directing their tremendous energies. "Thanks, Udon," I said. "I think I grasped the general idea. It was certainly a surprise some of my scientific friends on Earth." My passing reference to scientists started me thinking of the vast accumulation of theories I was about to see shattered when I landed on Jupiter within the next 24 hours. It certainly must be habitable for a race quite similar to our own. These people had lungs, a heart, kidneys, a liver, and other internal organs similar to our own. I knew this for a fact, as I could see them every time one of the Morgors stood between me and a bright light. So thin and transparent was the parchment-like skin that stretched tightly over their frames. Once more, the scientists would be wrong. I felt sorry for them. They have been wrong so many times and had to eat humble pie. There were those scientists, for instance, who clung to the Ptolemaic system of the universe, and who, after Galileo had discovered 4 of the moons of Jupiter in 1610, argued that such pretended discoveries were absurd. Their arguments being that since we have 7 openings in the head, 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and a mouth, there could be in the heavens but 7 planets. Having dismissed Galileo's absurd pretensions in this scientific manner, they caused him to be thrown into jail. When at a distance of about 500,000 miles from Jupiter, the ship began to slow down very gradually in preparation for a landing. And some 3 or 4 hours later, we entered the thick cloud envelope which surrounds the planet. We were barely crawling along now at not more than 600 miles an hour. I was all eagerness to see the surface of Jupiter, and extremely impatient of the time that it took the ship to traverse the envelope, in which we could see absolutely nothing. At last we broke through, and what a sight was revealed to my astonished eyes! A great world lay below me, illuminated by a weird red light which seemed to emanate from the inner surface of the cloud envelope, shedding a rosy glow over mountain, hill, dale, plain, and ocean. At first I could in no way account for this all-pervading illumination, but presently, my eyes roving over the magnificent panorama lying below me, I saw in the distance an enormous volcano, from which giant flames billowed upward thousands of feet into the air. And I was to learn later, the crater of this giant was a full 100 miles in diameter, and along the planet's equator there stretched a chain of these gargantuan torches for some 30,000 miles, while others were dotted over the entire surface of the globe, giving both light and heat to a world that would have been dark and cold without them. As we dropped lower, I saw what appeared to be cities, all located at a respectful distance from these craters. In the air, I saw several ships similar to that which had brought me from Mars. Some were very small. Others were much larger than the one with which I had become so familiar. 2 small ships approached us, and we slowed down almost to a stop. They were evidently patrol ships. From several ports, guns were trained on us. One of the ships lay at a little distance. The other came alongside. Our commander raised a hatch in the upper surface of the ship above the control room and stuck his head out. A door in the side of the patrol ship opened, and an officer appeared. The two exchanged a few words. Then the commander of the patrol ship saluted and closed the door in which we had appeared. We were free to proceed. All this had taken place at an altitude of some 5,000 feet. We now spiraled down slowly toward a large city. Later, I learned that it covered an area of about 400 square miles. It was entirely walled, and the walls in the building were a uniform dark brown color, as were the pavements of the avenues. It was a dismal, repellent city, built entirely on volcanic rock. Within its boundaries, I could see no sign of vegetation. Not a patch of sward. Not a shrub. Not a tree. No color to relieve the monotony of somber brown. The city was perfectly rectangular, having a long axis of about 25 miles and a width of about 16. The avenues were perfectly straight and equidistant, one from the other, cutting the city into innumerable identical square blocks. The buildings were all perfect rectangles, though not all of either the same size or height. The only break in the depressing monotony of this gloomy city. Well, not the only break. There were open spaces where there were no buildings. Perhaps plazas or parade grounds. But these I did not notice until we had dropped quite low above the city, as they were all paved with the same dark brown rock. The city was quite as depressing in appearance as is Salt Lake City from the air on an overcast February day. The only relief from this insistent sense of gloom was the rosy light which pervaded the scene, the reflection of the flames of the great volcanoes from the inner surface of the cloud envelope. This and the riotous growth of tropical verdure beyond the city's walls. Weird, unearthly growths of weird, unearthly hues. Accompanied by the 2 patrol ships, we now dropped gently into a large open space near the center of the city, coming to rest close to a row of hangars in which were many craft similar to our own. We were immediately surrounded by a detail of warriors, and, much to my surprise, I saw a number of human beings much like myself in appearance, except that their skins were purple. They were unarmed and quite naked except for G-strings, having no harness such as is worn by the Morgors. As soon as we had disembarked, these people ran the ship into the hangar. They were slaves. There were no interchanges of greetings between the returning Morgors and those who had come out to meet the ship. The 2 commanding officers saluted one another and exchanged a few routine military brevities. The commander of our ship gave his name, which was Haglion, the name of his ship, and stated that he was returning from Mars. He called it Garibus. Then he detailed 10 of his own men to accompany him as guards for Udon and me. They surrounded us, and we walked from the landing field in the wake of Haglion. He led us along a broad avenue filled with pedestrian and other traffic. On the sidewalks, there were only Morgors. The purple people walked in the gutters. Many Morgors were mounted on enormous, repulsive-looking creatures with an infinite number of legs. They reminded me of huge centipedes, their bodies being jointed similarly, each joint being about 18 inches long. Their heads were piscine and extremely ugly. Their jaws were equipped with many long, sharp teeth. Like nearly all the land animals of Jupiter, as I was to learn later, they were ungulate, hoofs evidently being rendered necessary by the considerable areas of hardened lava on the surface of the planet, as well as by the bits of lava rock which permeate the soil. These creatures were sometimes of great length, seating as high as 10 or 12 Morgors on their backs. There were other beasts of burden on the avenue. They were of strange, unearthly forms, but I shall not bore you by describing them here. Above this traffic moved small flyers in both directions. Thus the avenue accommodated a multitude of people. Strange, dour people who seldom spoke, and, as far as I have seen, never laughed. They might have, as indeed they looked, risen from sad graves to rattle their bones in mock life in a cemetery city of the dead. Udon and I walked in the gutter, a guard on the sidewalk close beside each of us. We were not good enough to walk where the Morgors walked. Haglion led us to a large plaza surrounded by buildings of considerable size, but of no beauty. A few of them boasted towers, some squat, some tall, all ugly. They looked as though they had been built to endure throughout the ages. We were conducted to one of those buildings, before the entrance to which a single sentry stood. Haglion spoke to him, and he summoned an officer from the interior of the building, after which we all entered. Our names and a description of each of us were entered into a large book. Haglion was given a receipt for us, after which he and our original escort left. Our new custodian issued instructions to several warriors who were in the room, and they hustled Udon and me down a spiral stairway to a dim basement, where we were thrown into a gloomy cell. Our escort locked the door on us and departed. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. And the Savators. Although I had often wondered about Jupiter, I had never hoped nor cared to visit it because of the inhospitable conditions which earthly scientists assure us pertain to this great planet. However, here I was, and the conditions were not at all as the scientists had described. Unquestionably, the mass of Jupiter is far greater than that of Earth or Mars. Yet I felt the gravitational pull far less than I had upon Earth. It was even less than that which I had experienced upon Mars. This was due, I realized, to the rapid revolution of the planet upon its axis. Centrifugal force, tending to throw me off into space, more than outweighed the increased force of gravitation. I had never before felt so light upon my feet. I was intrigued by contemplation of the height and distances to which I might jump. The cell in which I found myself, while large, precluded any experiments along that line. It was a large room of barred, brown lava rock. A few white lights set in recesses in the ceiling gave meager illumination. From the center of one wall, a little stream of water tinkled into a small cavity in the floor, the overflow being carried off by a gutter through a small hole in the end wall of the cell. There were some grass mats on the floor. These constituted the sole furnishings of the bleak prison. "The Morgors are thoughtful hosts," I remarked to Udon. "They furnish water for drinking and bathing. They have installed sewage facilities. They have given us whereon to lie or sit. Our cell is lighted. It is strong. We are secure against the attacks of our enemies. However, as far as the Morgors are concerned, Shh! Cautioned Udon. "We are not alone." He nodded toward the far end of the cell. I looked, and for the first time perceived what appeared to be the figure of a man stretched upon a mat. Simultaneously, it arose and came toward us. It was, indeed, a man. "You need have no fear of me," he said. "Say what you please of the Morgors. You could not possibly conceive any terms of opprobrium in which to describe them more virulent than those which I have long used, and considered inadequate. Except that the man's skin was a light blue, I could not see that he differed materially in physical appearance from Udon and myself. His body, which was almost naked, was quite hairless, except for a heavy growth on his head, and for eyebrows and eyelashes. He spoke the same language as the Morgors. Udon and I had been conversing in the universal language of Barsoom. I was surprised that the man had been able to understand us. Udon and I were both silent for a moment. "Perhaps," suggested our cellmate, "you do not understand the language of Erebus, eh?" "We do," I said, "but we were surprised that you understood our language." The fellow laughed. "I did not," he said. "You mentioned the Morgors, so I knew that you were speaking of them. And then, when your companion discovered me, he warned you to silence. So I guessed that you were saying something uncomplimentary about our captors. Tell me, who are you? You are no Morgors, nor do you look like us Savators." "We are from Barsoom," I said. "The Morgors call it Garabus," explained Udon. "I have heard of it," said the Savator. "It is a world that lies far above the clouds. The Morgors are going to invade it. I suppose they have captured you, either to obtain information from you, or to hold you as hostages." "For both purposes, I imagine," said Udon. "Why are you in prison?" "I accidentally bumped into a Morgor who was crossing an avenue at an intersection. He struck me, and I knocked him down. For that, I shall be destroyed at the graduation exercises of the next class." "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "The education of the Morgor youth consists almost wholly of subjects and exercises connected with the art of war. Because it is spectacular, because it arouses the bloodlust of the participants and the spectators, Personal combat winds up the exercises upon graduation day. Those of the graduating class who survive are inducted in the warrior caste, the highest caste among the Morgors. Art, literature, and science, except as they pertain to war, are held in contempt by the Morgors. They have been kept alive upon Erebus only through the efforts of us Savators. But, unfortunately, to the neglect of offensive military preparation and training. Being a peace-loving people, we armed only for defense. He smiled ruefully and shrugged. But wars are not won by defensive methods. Tell us more about the graduating exercises, said Udon. The idea is intriguing. With whom does the graduating class contend? With criminals and slaves, replied the Savator. Mostly men of my race, he added. Although sometimes there are Morgor criminals of the worst types sentenced to die thus. It is supposed to be the most shameful death that a Morgor can die, fighting shoulder to shoulder with members of a lower order against their own kind. Members of a lower order? I exclaimed. Do the Morgors consider you that? Just a step above the dumb beasts, but accountable for our acts because we are supposed to be able to differentiate between right and wrong. Wrong being any word or act or facial expression adversely critical of anything Morgorian, or that can be twisted into a subversive act or gesture. And suppose you survive the graduating contest, I asked. Are you then set at liberty? In theory, yes, he replied. But in practice, never. You mean they fail to honor terms of their own making? Demanded Udon. The Savator laughed. They are entirely without honor, he said. Yet I do not know that they would not liberate one who survived the combat. Because, insofar as I know, no one ever has. You see, the members of the class outnumber their antagonists 2-1. This statement gave me a still lower estimate of the character of the Morgors than I had already inferred from my own observation of them. It is not unusual that a warlike people excel in chivalry and a sense of honor. But where all other characteristics are made subservient to brutality, finer humanistic instincts atrophy and disappear. We sat in silence for some time. It was broken by the Savator. I do not know your names, he said. Mine is Xandar. As I told him ours, a detail of Morgor warriors came to our cell and ordered Udon and me to accompany them. Goodbye, said Xandar. We probably shall never meet again. Shut up, thing, admonished one of the warriors. Xandar winked at me and laughed. The Morgor was furious. Silence, creature, he growled. I thought for a moment that he was going to fall upon Xandar with his sword, but he who was in charge of the detail ordered him out of the cell. The incident was but another proof of the egomaniac arrogance of the Morgors. However, it helped to crystallize within me an admiration and liking for the Savator that had been growing since first he spoke to us. Udon and I were led across the plaza to a very large building, the entrance to which was heavily guarded. The hideous, grinning, skull-like heads of the warriors and their skeletal limbs and bodies, together with the dark and cavernous entrance to the building, suggested a grisly fantasia of Hell's entrance, guarded by the rotting dead. It was not a pleasant thought. We were held here for quite some time, during which some of the warriors discussed us, as one might discuss a couple of stray alley cats. "They are like the Savators, and yet unlike them," said one. "They are quite as hideous," said another. "One of them is much darker than the other." Now, for the first time, I was struck by the color of these Morgors. Instead of being ivory color, they were a pink or rosy shade. I looked at Udon. He was a very dark red. A glance at my arms and hands showed that they, too, were dark red, but not as dark a red as Udon. At first I was puzzled. Then I realized that the reflection of the red glare of the volcanoes from the inner surface of the cloud envelope turned our reddish skins a darker red, and made the yellow, parchment-like skins of the Morgors appear pink. As I looked around, I realized that this same reddish hue appeared upon everything within sight. It reminded me of a verse in the popular song I heard some time ago on one of my visits to Earth. It went, I think, "I am looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, and everything is rosy now." Well, everything wasn't rosy with me, no matter how rosy this world looked. Presently, an officer came to the entrance and ordered our escort to bring us in. The interior of the building was as unlovely as its exterior. Although this was, as I later learned, the principal palace of the Morgor ruler, there was absolutely no sign of ornamentation. No art relieved the austerity of gloomy, lava-brown corridors and bare rectangular chambers. No hangings softened the sharp edges of openings. No rugs hid even a part of the bare, brown floors. The pictureless walls frowned down upon us. I have seldom been in a more depressing environment. Even the pits beneath the deserted cities of Barsoom often had interesting vaulted ceilings, arched doorways, elaborate old iron grillwork, attesting the artistic temperaments of their designers. The Morgors, like death, were without art. We were led to a large, bare chamber, in which a number of Morgors were clustered about a desk, at which another of the creatures was seated. All Morgors look very much alike to me, yet they do have individual facial and physical characteristics. So I was able to recognize Haglion among those standing about the desk. It was Haglion who had commanded the ship that had brought me from Mars. Udon and I were halted at some distance from the group, and as we stood there, two other red Martians were brought into the room, a man and a girl. The girl was very beautiful. "Vaja!" exclaimed Udon. But I did not need this evidence to know who she was. I was equally certain that the man was Multis Par, Prince of Zor. He appeared nervous and downcast. But even so, the natural arrogance of the man was indelibly stamped upon his features. At Udon's exclamation, one of those guarding us whispered, "Silence, thing!" Vaja's eyes went wide in incredulity as she recognized my companion, and she took an impulsive step toward him. But a warrior seized her arm and restrained her. The faint shadow of a malicious smile touched the thin lips of Maltese Par. The man seated at the desk issued an order, and all four of us were brought forward and lined up in front of him. The fellow differed in appearance not at all from other Morgors. He wore no ornaments. His harness and weapons were quite plain, but evidently serviceable. They were marked with a hieroglyph that differed from similar markings on the harness and weapons of other Morgors, as those of each of the others differed from all the rest. I did not know what they signified, but later learned that each hieroglyph indicated the name, rank, and title of him who wore it. The hieroglyph of the man at the desk was that of Bandolion, Emperor of the Morgors. Spread upon the desk before Bandolion was a large map, which I instantly recognized as that of Barsoom. The man and his staff had evidently been studying it. As Udon and I were halted before his desk with Vaja and Maltese Par, Bandolion looked up at the Prince of Zor. "Which is he?" he asked, "who is called Warlord of Barsoom?" Maltese Par indicated me, and Bandolion turned his hollow eyes upon me. It was as though Death had looked upon me and signaled me out as his own. "I understand that your name is John Carter," he said. I nodded in affirmation. "While you are of a lower order," he continued, "yet it must be that you are endowed with intelligence of a sort. It is to this intelligence that I address my commands. I intend to invade and conquer Barsoom." He called it Garabus. "And I command you to give me all the assistance in your power by acquainting me and my staff with such military information as you may possess relative to the principal powers of Garabus, especially that one known as the Empire of Helium. In return for this, your life will be spared." I looked at him for a moment, and then I laughed in his face. The faintest suggestion of a flush overspread the pallor of his face. "You dare laugh at me, thing?" he growled. "It is my answer to your proposition," I said. Bandolion was furious. "Take it away and destroy it," he ordered. "Wait, great Bandolion," urged Maltese Par. "His knowledge is almost indispensable to you, and I have a plan whereby you may make use of it." "What is it?" demanded Bandolion. "He has a mate whom he worships. Seize her, and he will pay any price to protect her from harm." "Not the price the Morgor has asked," I said to Maltese Par. "And if she is brought here, it will be the seal upon your death warrant." "Enough of this," snapped Bandolion. "Take them all away." "Shall I destroy the one called John Carter?" asked the officer who commanded the detail that had brought us to the audience chamber. "Not immediately," replied Bandolion. "He struck a Morgor," said Haglion, "one of my officers." "He shall die for that, too," said Bandolion. "That would be twice," I said. "Take it away," snapped Bandolion. As we were led away, Vaja and Udon gazed longingly at one another. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. I would be a traitor. Xandar, The Savator was surprised to see us return to the cell in so short a time. In fact, he said, I did not expect to ever see you again. How did it happen? I explained briefly what had occurred in the audience chamber, adding, I have been returned to the cell to await death. And you, Udon? He asked. I don't know why they bothered to take me up there, replied Udon. Bandolion paid no attention to me whatever. He had a reason, you may rest assured. He is probably trying to break down your morale by letting you see the girl you love, in the belief that you will influence John Carter to accede to his demands. John Carter lives only because Bandolion hopes to eventually break down his resistance. Time dragged heavily in that cell beneath the Morgors city. For that matter, there would have been none had we been above ground, for there are no nights upon Jupiter. It is always day. The sun, 483 million miles away, would shed but little light upon the planet were it exposed to the full light of the star that is the center of our solar system. But that little light is obscured by the dense cloud envelope which surrounds this distant world. What light filters through is negated by the gigantic volcanic torches which bathe the entire planet in perpetual daylight. Although Jupiter rotates upon its axis in less than 10 hours, its day is for eternity. Udon and I learned much concerning the conditions on the planet from Zanor. He told us of the vast warm seas which seethed in constant tidal agitation, resulting from the constantly changing positions of the 4 larger moons, which revolve about Jupiter in 42 hours, 85 hours, 172 hours, and 400 hours, respectively, while the planet spins upon its axis, making a complete revolution in 9 hours and 55 minutes. He told us of vast continents and enormous islands, and I could well imagine that such existed, as a rough estimate indicated that the area of the planet exceeded 23 billion square miles. As the axis of Jupiter is nearly perpendicular to the plane of its motion, having an inclination of only about 30, there could be no great variety of seasons. So over this enormous area, there existed an equitable climate, warm and humid, perpetually lighted and heated by the innumerable volcanoes which pit the surface of the planet. And here was I, an adventurer who had explored 2 worlds, cooped up in a subterranean cell upon the most amazing and wonderful planet of our entire solar system. It was maddening. Zanor told us the continent upon which we were was the largest. It was the ancestral home of the Morgors, from which they had, over a great period of time, sallied forth to conquer the remainder of the world. The conquered countries, each of which was ruled by what might be called a Morgor governor-general, paid tribute to the Morgors in manufactured goods, foodstuffs, and slaves. There were still a few areas, small and considered of little value by the Morgors, which retained their liberty and their own governments. From such an area came Zanor, a remote island called Zanor. It is a land of tremendous mountains, thickly forested with trees of great size and height, he said. Because of our mountains and our forests, it is an easy land to defend against an airborne enemy. When he told me the height of some of the lofty peaks of Zanor, it was with difficulty that I could believe him. To a height of 20 miles above sea level rose the majestic king of Zanor's mountains. "The Morgors have sent many an expedition against us," said Xandar. "They get a foothold in some little valley, and there, above them and surrounding them, in mountain fastnesses that are familiar to us and unknown to them, we have had them at our mercy, picking them off literally one by one until they are so reduced in numbers that they dare remain no longer. They kill many of us, too, and they take prisoners. I was taken thus in one of their invasions. If they brought enough ships and enough men, I suppose they could conquer us. But our land is scarcely worth the effort, and I think they prefer to leave us as we are, to give their recruits practice in actual warfare." I don't know how long we had been confined when Par was brought to our cell by an officer and a detachment of warriors. He came to exhort me to cooperate with Bandolion. "The invasion and conquest of Barsoom are inevitable," he said. "By assisting Bandolion, you can mitigate the horror of it for the inhabitants of Barsoom. You will thus be serving our world far better than by stupidly and stubbornly refusing to meet Bandolion halfway." "You are wasting your time," I told him. "But our lives depend upon it," he cried. "You and Udon, Vaja and I shall die if you refuse. Bandolion's patience is almost worn out now." He looked pleadingly at Udon. "We could not die in a better cause," said Udon, much to my surprise. "I shall be glad to die in atonement for the wrong that I did John Carter." "You are two fools!" exclaimed Par angrily. "At least we are not traitors," I reminded him. "You will die, John Carter," he growled. "But before you die, you shall see your mate in the clutches of Bandolion. She has been sent for. Now, if you change your mind, send word by one of those who bring your meals." I sprang forward and knocked the creature down. I should have killed him then, had not the Morgors dragged him from the cell. So they had sent for Dejathoris, and I was helpless. They would get her. I knew how they would get her, by assuring her that only through her cooperation could my immediate death be averted. I wondered if they would win. Would I, in the final test, sacrifice my beloved princess or my adopted country? Frankly, I did not know. But I had the example of Udon to guide me. He had placed patriotism above love. Would I? Time dragged on in this gloomy cell, where there was no time. We three plotted innumerable futile plans of escape. We improvised games to help mitigate the monotony of our dull existence. More profitably, however, Udon and I learned much from Xandar concerning this great planet. And Xandar learned much of what lay beyond the eternal cloud envelope which hides from the view of the inhabitants of Jupiter, the sun, the other planets, the stars, and even their own moons. All that Xandar knew of them was the little he had been able to glean from remarks dropped by Morgors of what had been seen from their interplanetary ships. Their knowledge of astronomy was only slightly less than their interest in the subject, which was practically non-existent. War, conquest, and bloodshed were their sole interests in life. At last there came a break in the deadly monotony of our lives. A new prisoner was thrown into the cell with us. and he was a Morgor. The situation was embarrassing. Had our numbers been reversed, had there been 3 Morgors and 1 of us, there would have been no doubt as to the treatment that one would have received. He would have been ostracized, imposed upon, and possibly abused. The Morgor expected this fate. He went into a far corner of the cell and awaited what he had every reason to expect. Udon, Xandar, and I discussed the situation in whispers. That must have been a trying time for the Morgor. We 3 finally decided to treat the creature simply as a fellow prisoner, until such time as his own conduct should be our eventual guide. Xandar was the first to break the ice. In a friendly manner, he asked what mischance had brought the fellow to this pass. "I killed one who had an influential relative in the palace of Bandolian," he replied. And as he spoke, he came over closer to us. "For that I shall die, probably in the graduating exercises of the next class." "We shall doubtless all die together," he added with a hollow laugh. He paused. "Unless we escape," he concluded. "Then we shall die," said Xandar. "Perhaps," said the Morgor. "One does not escape from the prisons of the Morgors," said Xandar. I was interested in that one word, perhaps. It seemed to me fraught with intentional meaning. I determined to cultivate this animated skeleton. It could do no harm and might lead to good. I told him my name and the names of my companions. Then I asked his. "Vorian," he replied. "But I need no introduction to you, John Carter. We have met before. Don't you recognize me?" I had to admit that I did not. Vorian laughed. "I slapped your face, and you knocked me across the ship. It was a noble blow. For a long time, they thought that I was dead." "Oh," I said, "you were one of my instructors. It may please you to know that I'm going to die for that blow." "Perhaps not," said Vorian. There was that perhaps again. What did the fellow mean? Much to our surprise, Vorian proved not at all a bad companion. Toward Bandolian and the powerful forces that had condemned him to death and thrown him into prison, he was extremely bitter. I learned from him that the apparent veneration and loyalty accorded Bandolian by his people was wholly a matter of disciplined regimentation. At heart, Vorian loathed the man as a monster of cruelty and tyranny. "Fear and generations of training hold our apparent loyalty," he said. After he had been with us for some time, he said to me, "You 3 have been very decent to me. You could have made my life miserable here, and I could not have blamed had you done so, for you must hate us Morgors." "We are all in the same boat," I said. "We could gain nothing by fighting among ourselves. If we worked together, perhaps." I used his own perhaps. Vorian nodded. "I have been thinking that we might work together," he said. "To what end?" I asked. "Escape." "Is that possible?" "Perhaps." Udon and Xandar were eager listeners. Vorian turned to the latter. "If we should escape," he said, "you three have a country to which you might go with every assurance of finding asylum, while I could expect only death in any country upon the face of Erebus. If you could promise me safety in your country—" He paused, evidently awaiting Xandar's reaction. "I can only promise to do my best for you," said Xandar. "But I am confident that if you were the means of my liberation and return to Zanor, you would be permitted to remain there in safety." Our plotting was interrupted by the arrival of the detail of warriors. The officer in command singled me out and ordered me from the cell. If I were to be separated from my companions, I saw the fabric of my dream of escape dissolve before my eyes. They led me from the building and across the plaza to the palace of Bandolion, and after some delay, I found myself again in the audience chamber. From behind his desk, the hollow eyes of the tyrant stared at me from their grinning skull. "I am giving you your last chance," said Bandolion. Then he turned to one of his officers. "Bring in the other," he said. There was a short wait, then a door at my right opened, and a guard of warriors brought in the other. It was Dejah Thoris, my incomparable Dejah Thoris. What a lovely creature she was as she crossed the floor surrounded by hideous Morgors. What majestic dignity, what fearlessness distinguished her carriage and her mien. That such as she should be sacrificed even for a world. They halted her scarce 2 paces from me. She gave me a brave smile and whispered, "Courage. I know now why I am here. Do not weaken. Better death than dishonor." "What is she saying?" demanded Bandolion. I thought quickly. I knew that the chances were that not one of them there understood the language of Barsoom. In their stupid arrogance, they would not deign to master the tongue of a lower order. "She but pleads with me to save her," I said. I saw Dejah Thoris smile. Evidently, they had taught her the language of the Morgors on a long voyage from Mars. "And you will be wise to do so," said Bandolion. "Otherwise, she will be given to Multus Par, and afterward tortured and mutilated many times before she is permitted to die." I shuddered in contemplation of such a fate for my princess, and in that moment I weakened once again. "If I aid you, will she be returned unharmed to Helium?" I asked. "Both of you will, after I have conquered Garibus," replied Bandolion. "No, no," whispered Dejah Thoris. "I should rather die than return to Helium with a traitor. No, John Carter, you could never be that, even to save my life." "But the torture, the mutilation. I would be a traitor 1,000 times over to save you from that. And I promise you that no odium would be attached to you. I should never return to Barsoom." "I shall be neither tortured nor mutilated," she said. "Sewn into my harness is a long, thin blade." I understood, and I was relieved. "Very well," I said. "If we are to die for Barsoom, it is not more than thousands of our brave warriors have done in the past. But we are not dead yet. Remember that, my princess. Do not use that long, thin blade upon yourself until hope is absolutely dead. While you live, hope will live, she said. Come, come, said Bandolion. I have listened long enough to your silly jabbering. Do you accept my proposition? I am considering it, I said. But I must have a few more words with my mate. Let them be few, snapped the Morgor. I turned to Dejathoris. Where are you in prison? I asked. On the top floor of a tower at the rear of this building, at the corner nearest the great volcano. There is another Barsoomian with me, a girl from Zor. Her name is Vaja. Bandolion was becoming impatient. He drummed nervously on his desk with his knuckles and snapped his grinning jaws together like castanets. Enough of this, he growled. What is your decision? The matter is one of vast importance to me, I replied. I cannot decide it in a moment. Return me to my cell so that I may think it over and discuss it with Udon, who also has much at stake. Take it back to its cell, ordered Bandolion. And then, to me, you shall have time, but not much. My patience is exhausted. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Escape. I had no plan. I was practically without hope. Yet I had gained at least a brief reprieve for Dejathoris. Perhaps a means of escape might offer itself. Upon such unsubstantial fare, I fed the shred of hope to which I clung. My cellmates were both surprised and relieved when I was returned to them. I told them briefly of what had occurred in the audience chamber of Bandolion. Udon showed great grief when he learned that Dejathoris was in the clutches of the Morgors, and cursed himself for the part he had taken in bringing her and me to a situation in which we faced the alternatives of death or dishonor. Vain regrets never got anyone anywhere, I said. But they won't get us out of this cell. They won't get Dejathoris and Vaja out of Bandolion's tower. Forget them. We have other things to think about. I turned to Vorian. You have spoken of the possibility of escape. Explain yourself. He was not accustomed to being spoken to thus peremptorily by one of the lower orders, as the Morgors considered us. But he laughed, taking it in good part. The Morgors cannot smile. From birth to death, they wear their death's head grin, frozen, unchangeable. There is just a chance, he said. It is barely a chance. Slender would be an optimistic description of it. But if it fails, we shall be no worse off than we are now. Tell us what it is, I said. I can pick the lock of our cell door, he explained. If luck is with us, we can escape from this building. I know a way that is little used, for I was for long one of the prison guard. What chance would we have once we were in the streets of the city? Demanded Udon. We three, at least, will be picked up immediately. Not necessarily, said Vorian. There are many slaves of the avenues who look exactly like Xandar. Of course, the color of the skin of you men from Garibus might attract attention, but that is a chance we shall have to take. And after we are in the streets, asked Xandar, what then? I shall pretend that I am in charge of you. I shall treat you as slaves are so often treated that it will arouse no comment, nor attract any undue attention. I shall have to be rough with you, but you will understand. I shall herd you to a field where there are many ships. There I shall tell the guard that I have orders to bring you to clean a certain ship. In this field are only the private ships of the rich and powerful among us, and I well know a certain ship that belongs to one who seldom uses it. If we can reach this ship and board it, nothing can prevent us from escaping. In an hour from now, we shall be on our way to Zanor, if all goes well. And if we can take Vaja and Dejathoris with us, I added. I had forgotten them, said Vorian. You would risk your lives for 2 females? Certainly, said Udan. Vorian shrugged. You are strange creatures, he said. We Morgors would not risk a little finger for a score of them. The only reason that we tolerate them at all is that they are needed to replenish the supply of warriors. To attempt to rescue 2 of yours may easily end in disaster for us all. However, we shall make the attempt, he said. Are you with us, Xandar? I asked the Savitor. To the end, he said, whatever it may be. Again, Vorian shrugged. As you will, he said, but not with much enthusiasm. Then he set to work on the lock, and in a very short time, the door swung open, and we stepped out into the corridor. Vorian closed the door and relocked it. This is going to give them food for speculation, he remarked. He led us along the corridor in the opposite direction from that in which we had been brought to it, and from which all those had come who had approached our cell since our incarceration. The corridor became dark and dusty the farther we traversed it. Evidently, it was little used. At its very end was a door, the lock to which Vorian quickly picked. And a moment later we stepped out into a narrow alleyway. So simple had been our escape up to now that I immediately apprehended the worst. Such luck could not last. Even the alley which we had entered was deserted. No one had seen us emerge from the prison. But when we reached the end of the alley and turned into a broad avenue, the situation was very different. Here were many people. Morgors upon the sidewalks, slaves in the gutters, strange beasts of burden carrying their loads of passengers upon the pavement. Now, Vorian began to berate and cuff us as we walked in the gutter, and he upon the sidewalk. He directed us away from the central plaza, and finally into less frequented avenues. Yet we still passed too many Morgors to suit me. At any minute, one of them might notice the unusual coloration of Udan's skin, and mine. I glanced at Xandar to note if the difference between his coloration and ours was at all startling, and I got a shock. Xandar's skin had been blue. Now it was purple. It took me a moment to realize that the change was due to the rosy light of the volcano's flames, turning Xandar's natural blue to purple. We had covered quite a little distance in safety when a Morgor, passing, eyed us suspiciously. He let us go by him. Then he wheeled and called to Vorian. "Who are those two?" he demanded. "They are not Savators." "They have been ill," said Vorian, "and their color has changed." I was surprised that the fellow could think so quickly. "Well, who are you?" asked the fellow. "And what are you doing in charge of slaves while unarmed?" Vorian looked down into his eyes and simulated surprise. "Why, I must have forgotten them," he said. "I think that you are lying to me," said the fellow. "Come along with me, all of you." Here seemed to be an end of our hopes of escape. I glanced up and down the street. It appeared to be a quiet residential avenue. There was no one near us. Several small ships rested at the curb in front of drear, brown domiciles. That was all. No eyes were upon us. I stepped close to the fellow who had thus rashly presented himself as an obstacle in the way of Deja Thoris' rescue. I struck him once. I struck him with all my strength. He dropped like a log. "You have killed him!" exclaimed Vorian. "He was one of Bandolian's most trusted officers. If we are caught now, we shall be tortured to death." "We need not be caught," I said. "Let's take one of these ships standing at the curb. Why take the time and the risk to go farther?" Vorian shook his head. "They wouldn't do," he said. "They are only for intramural use. They are low-altitude ships that would never get over even a relatively small mountain range. But more important still, they cannot be rendered invisible. We shall have to go on to the field, as we have planned." "To avoid another such encounter as we have just experienced," I said, "we had better take one of these ships, at least to the vicinity of the field." "We shall be no worse off adding theft to murder," said Xandar. Vorian agreed, and a moment later we were all on a small ship and sailing along a few yards above the avenue. Keenly interested, I carefully noted everything that Vorian did in starting the motor and controlling the craft. It was necessary for me to ask only a few questions in order to have an excellent grasp of the handling of the little ship. So familiar was I with the airships of two other worlds. Perhaps I should never have the opportunity to operate one of these, but I could do no harm to know how. We quitted the flyer a short distance from the field and continued on foot. As Vorian had predicted, a guard halted us and questioned him. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The guard appeared skeptical, and the reason for his skepticism was largely that which had motivated the officer I had killed, to question the regularity of Vorian's asserted mission: the fact that Vorian was unarmed. The guard told us to wait while he summoned an officer. That would have been fatal, I felt, that I might have to kill this man, too. But I did not see how I could do it without being observed, as there were many Morgors upon the field, though none in our immediate vicinity. Vorian saved the day. "Come, come," he exclaimed in a tone of exasperation. "I can't wait here all day while you send for an officer. I am in a hurry. Let me take these slaves on and start them to work. The officer can come to the ship and question me, as well as he can question me here." The guard agreed that there was something in this, and, after ascertaining the name and location of the ship which we were supposed to clean, he permitted us to proceed. I breathed an inward sigh of relief. After we had left him, Vorian said that he had given him the name and location of a different ship than that which we were planning to steal. Vorian was no fool. The ship that Vorian had selected was a slim craft, which appeared to have been designed for speed. We lost no time boarding her, and once again I watched every move that Vorian made, questioning him concerning everything that was not entirely clear to me. Although I had spent some 18 days aboard one of these Morgorian ships, I had learned nothing relative to their control, as I had never been allowed in the control room or permitted to ask questions. First, Vorian magnetized the hull and sprayed it with the fine sands of invisibility. Then he started the motor and nosed up gently. I had explained my plan to him, and once he had gained a little altitude, he headed for the palace of Bandolian. Through a tiny lens set in the bow of this ship, the view ahead was reflected upon a ground glass plate, just as an image is projected upon the finder of a camera. There were several of these lenses, and through one of them I presently saw the square tower at the rear of the palace, the tower in which Dejathoris and Vaja were confined. "When I bring the ship up to the window," said Vorian, "you will have to work fast, as the moment that we open the door in the ship's hull, part of the interior of the ship will be visible. Someone in the palace, or upon the ground, may notice it, and instantly we shall be surrounded by guard and patrol ships." "I shall work fast," I said. I must admit that I was more excited than usual as Vorian brought the craft alongside the tower window, which we had seen was wide open and unbarred. Udon and Xandar stood by to the open door so that I could leap through the window, and then to close it immediately after I had come aboard with the two girls. I could no longer see the window now that the craft was broadside to it, but at a word from Vorian, Udon and Xandar slid the door back. The open window was before me, and I leapt through it into the interior of the tower room. Fortunately for me, fortunately for Dejathoris, and fortunately for Vaja, it was the right room. The two girls were there, but they were not alone. A man held Dejathoris in his arms, his lips searching for hers. Vaja was striking him futilely on the back, and Dejathoris was trying to push his face from hers. I seized the man by the neck and hurled him across the room. Then I pointed to the window and the ship beyond, and told the girls to get aboard as fast as they could. They needed no second invitation. As they ran across the room toward the window, the man rose and faced me. It was Multis Parr. Recognizing me, he almost went white. Then he whipped out his sword and simultaneously commenced to shout for the guard. Seeing that I was unarmed, he came for me. I could not turn and run for the window. Had I, he could have run me through long before I could have reached it. So I did the next best thing. I charged straight for him. This apparently suicidal act of mine evidently confused him, for he fell back. But when I was close to him, he lunged for me. I parried the thrust with my forearm. I was inside his point now, and an instant later, my fingers closed upon his throat. Like a fool, he dropped his sword then, and attempted to claw my fingers loose with his 2 hands. He could have shortened his hold on it and run me through the heart, but I had to take that chance. I would have finished him off in a moment had not the door of the room been thrown open to admit a dozen Morgor warriors. I was stunned. After everything had worked so well to have this happen, were all our plans to be thus thwarted? No, not all. I shouted to Udon. "Close the door and take off. It is a command." Udon hesitated. Dejathor stood at his side, with one hand outstretched toward me, and an indescribable expression of anguish on her face. She took a step forward as though to leap from the ship back into the room. Udon quickly barred her way, and then the ship started to move away. Slowly, the door slid closed, and once again, the craft was entirely invisible. All this transpired in but a few seconds, while I still clung to Multis Par's throat. His tongue protruded, and his eyes stared glassily. In a moment more, he would have been dead. Then the Morgor warriors were upon me, and I was dragged from my prey. My captors handled me rather roughly, and, perhaps, not without reason, for I'd knocked 3 of them unconscious before they overpowered me. Had I but had a sword, what I should have done to them then. But though I was battered and bruised as they hustled me down from the tower, I was smiling, for I was happy. Dejathorus had been snatched from the clutches of the skeleton men, and was, temporarily at least, safe. I had good cause for rejoicing. I was taken to a small, unlighted cell beneath the tower, and here I was manacled and chained to the wall. A heavy door was slammed shut as my captors left me, and I heard a key turn in the massive lock. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Pho Lar. In solitary confinement, unrelieved by even a suggestion of light, one is thrown entirely upon the resources of one's thoughts for mitigation of absolute boredom. Such boredom as sometimes leads to insanity for those of weak wills and feeble nerves. But my thoughts were pleasant thoughts. I envisaged Dejathorus safely bound for a friendly country in an invisible ship, which would be safe from capture. And I felt that 3 of those who accompanied her would be definitely friendly, and that one of them, Udon, might be expected to lay down his life to protect her, were that ever necessary. As to Vorian, I could not even guess what his attitude towards her would be. My own situation gave me little concern. I will admit that it looked rather hopeless, but I had been in tight places before, and yet managed to survive and escape. I still lived, and while life is in me, I never give up hope. I am a confirmed optimist, which, I think, gives me an attitude of mind that more often than not commands what we commonly term the breaks of life. Fortunately, I was not long confined in that dark cell. I slept once. For how long, I do not know. And I was very hungry when a detail of warriors came to take me away. Hungry and thirsty, for they had given me neither food nor water while I had been confined. I was not taken before Bandolion this time, but to one of his officers. A huge skeleton that continually opened and closed its jaws with a snapping and grinding sound. The creature was death incarnate. From the way he questioned me, I concluded that he must be the Lord High Inquisitor. In silence, he eyed me from those seemingly hollow sockets for a full minute before he spoke. Then he bellowed at me. "Thing!" he shouted. "For even a small part of what you have done, you deserve death. Death after torture." "You don't have to shout at me," I said. "I am not deaf." That enraged him, and he pounded upon his desk. "For impudence and disrespect, it will go harder with you." "I cannot show respect when I do not feel respect," I told him. "I respect only those who command my respect. I surely cannot respect a bag of bones with an evil disposition." I do not know why I deliberately tried to infuriate him. Perhaps it is just a weakness of mine to enjoy baiting enemies, whom I think contemptible. It is, I admit, a habit fraught with danger. And perhaps a stupid habit. But I have found that it sometimes so disconcerts an enemy as to give me a certain advantage. In this instance, I was at least successful in part. The creature was so furious that for some time it remained speechless. Then it leapt to its feet with drawn sword. My situation was far from enviable. I was unarmed, and the creature facing me was in an uncontrollable rage. In addition to all this, there were 4 or 5 other Morgors in the room, 2 of whom were holding my arms, 1 on either side. I was as helpless as a sheep in an abattoir. But as my would-be executioner came around the end of his desk to spit me on his blade, another Morgor entered the room. The newcomer took in the situation at a glance, and shouted, "Stop, Gorgum!" The thing coming for me hesitated a moment, then he dropped his point. "The creature deserves death," Gorgum said sullenly. "It defied and insulted me. Me, an officer of the great Bandolian." "Vengeance belongs to Bandolian," said the other. "And he has different plans for this insolent worm. What has your questioning developed?" "He has been so busy screaming at me that he has had no time to question me," I said. "Silence, low one," snapped the newcomer. "I can well understand," he said to Gorgum, "that your patience must have been sorely tried. But we must respect the wishes of the great Bandolian. Proceed with the investigation." Gorgum returned his sword to its scabbard and reseated himself at his desk. "What is your name?" he demanded. "JOHN CARTER, Prince of Helium," I replied. A scribe at Gorgum's side scribbled in a large book. I suppose that he was recording the question and the answer. He kept this up during the entire interview. "How did you and the other conspirators escape from the cell in which you were confined?" Gorgum asked. "Through the doorway," I replied. "That is impossible. The door was locked when you were placed in this cell. It was locked at the time your absence was discovered." "If you know so much, why bother to question me?" Gorgum's jaws snapped and ground more viciously than ever. "You see, horror," he said angrily, turning to the other officer. "The insolence of the creature." "Answer the nobleman's question," Horror snapped at me. "How did you pass through the locked door?" "It was not locked." "It was locked!" shouted Gorgum. I shrugged. "What is the use?" I asked. "It is a waste of time to answer the questions of one who knows more about the subject than I, notwithstanding the fact that he was not there." "Tell me, then, in your own words, how you escaped from the cell," said Horror in a less irritating tone of voice. "We picked the lock." "That would have been impossible," bellowed Gorgum. "Then we are still in the cell," I said. "Perhaps you had better go and look." "We are getting nowhere," snapped Horror. "Rapidly," I agreed. "I shall question the prisoner," said Horror. "We concede that you did escape from the cell." "Rather shrewd of you." He ignored the comment. "I cannot see that the means you adopted are of great importance. What we really wish to know is where your accomplices and the 2 female prisoners are now. Multus Par says that they escaped in a ship, probably one of our own, which was stolen from a flying field." "I do not know where they are." "Do you know where they plan to go?" "If I did, I would not tell you." "I command you to answer me on pain of death." I laughed at the creature. "You intend to kill me anyway, so your threat finds me indifferent." Horror kept his temper much better than had Gorgum, but I could see that he was annoyed. "You could preserve your life if you were more cooperative," he said. "Great Bandolion asks but little of you. Tell us where your accomplices intended going, and promise to aid the Great Bandolion in his conquest of helium, and your life will be spared." "No," I said. "Wait," urged Horror. "Bandolion will go even further. Following our conquest of helium, he will permit you and your mate to return to that country, and he will give you a high office in the new government he intends to establish there. If you refuse, you shall be destroyed. Your mate will be hunted down, and, I promise you, she will be found. Her fate will be infinitely worse than death. You had better think it over." I did not need to think over such a proposition. I can give you a final answer on both counts. My irrevocable answer. It is never. If Horror had had a lip, he would have doubtless have bitten it. He looked at me for a long minute. Then he said, "Fool!" After which he turned to Gorgum. "Have it placed with those who are being held for the next class." Then he left the room. I was now taken to a building located at some distance from those in which I had previously been incarcerated, and placed in a large cell with some 20 other prisoners, all of whom were Savators. "What have we here?" demanded one of my fellow prisoners after my escort had left and locked the door. "A man with red skin." "He is no Savator." "What are you, fellow?" I did not like the looks of him, nor his tone of voice. I was not seeking trouble with those with whom I was to be imprisoned, and with whom I was probably destined to die. So I walked away from the fellow and sat down on a bench in another part of the chamber, which was quite large. But the fool followed me and stood in front of me in a truculent attitude. "I asked you what you were," he said threateningly. "And when Pho Lar asks you a question, see that you answer it, and quickly. I am top man here." He looked around at the others. "That's right, isn't it?" he demanded of them. There were some sullen, affirmative grunts. I could see at once the fellow was unpopular. He appeared a man of considerable muscular development, and his reception of me, a newcomer among them, testified to the fact that he was a bully. It was evident that he had the other prisoners cowed. "You seem to be looking for trouble, Lofar," I said. "But I am not. I am already in enough trouble." "My name is Pho Lar, fellow," he barked. "What difference does it make? You would stink by any name." The other prisoners immediately took interested notice. Some of them grinned. "I see that I shall have to put you into your place," said Pho Lar, advancing toward me angrily. "I do not want any trouble with you," I said. "It is bad enough to be in prison without quarreling with fellow prisoners." "You are evidently a coward," said Pho Lar. "And if you will get down on your knees and ask my pardon, I shall not harm you." I had to laugh at that, which made the fellow furious. Yet he hesitated to attack me. I realized then that he was a typical bully, yellow at heart. However, to save his face, he would probably attack me if he could not bluff me. "Don't make me angry," he said. "When I am angry, I do not know my own strength. I might kill you." "I wonder if this would make you angry," I said, and slapped him across the cheek with my open palm. I slapped him so hard that he nearly fell down. I could have slapped him harder. This staggered him more than physically. The blood rushed to his blue face until it turned purple. He was in a spot. He had started something, and if he were to hold his self-appointed position as top man, as he had described himself, he would have to finish it. The other prisoners had now all arisen and formed a half-circle about us. They looked alternately at Pho Lar and me in eager anticipation. Pho Lar had to do something about that slap in the face. He rushed at me and struck out clumsily. As I warded off his blows, I realized that he was a very powerful man. But he lacked science, and I was sure that he lacked guts. I determined to teach him a lesson that he would not soon forget. I could have landed a blow in the first few seconds of our encounter that would have put him to sleep, but I preferred to play with him. I countered merely with another slap in the face. He came back with a haymaker that I ducked. Then I slapped him again, a little harder this time. "Good work!" exclaimed one of the prisoners. "Go to it, Red Man!" cried another. "Kill him!" shouted the third. Pho Lar tried to clinch, but I caught one of his wrists, wheeled around, bent over, and threw him over my shoulder. He lit heavily on the lava flooring. He lay there for a moment, and as he scrambled to his feet, I put a headlock on him and threw him again. This time he did not get up, so I picked him up and hit him on the chin. He went down for a long count. I was through with him and went and sat down. The prisoners gathered around me. I could see that they were pleased with the outcome of the fight. "Pho Lar's had this coming to him for a long time," said one. "He sure got it at last." "Who are you, anyway?" "My name is John Carter. I am from Garibus." "I have heard of you," said one. "I think we all have. The Morgors are furious at you because you tricked them so easily. I suppose they have sent you here to die with us." "My name is Han-Du." He held out a hand to me. It was the first time that I had seen this friendly gesture since leaving the Earth. The Martians place a hand upon your shoulder. I took his hand. "I'm glad to know you, Han-Du," I said. "If there are any more here like Pho Lar, I shall probably need a friend." "There are no more like him," said Han-Du. "And he is finished." "You intimated that you are all doomed to die," I said. "Do you know when or how?" "When the next class graduates, we shall be pitted against twice our number of Morgors. It will be soon now." End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. In the Arena. Pho Lar was unconscious for a long time. For a while, I thought that I might have killed him. But finally he opened his eyes and looked about. Then he sat up, felt on his head, and rubbed his jaw. When his eyes found me, he dropped them to the floor. Slowly and painfully, he got to his feet and started from the far side of the room. 4 or 5 of the prisoners immediately surrounded him. "Who's the top man now?" demanded one of them, and slapped him. 2 more struck him. They were pushing him around and buffeting him when I walked among them and pushed him away. "Leave him alone," I said. "He's had enough punishment for a while. When he has recovered, if one of you wishes to take him on, that will be all right. But you can't gang up on him." The biggest of them turned and faced me. "What have you got to say about it?" he demanded. "This," I replied, and knocked him down. He sat up and looked at me. "I was just asking," he said, and grinned a sickly grin. Then everybody laughed, and the tension was over. After this, we got along famously. All of us, even Pho Lar. I found them all rather decent men. Long imprisonment and the knowledge that they were facing death had frayed their nerves. What had followed my advent had cleared the air, much as a violent electrical storm does. After that, there was a lot of laughing and talking. I inquired if any of them were from Xandar's country, Zanor, but none of them was. Several of them knew where it was, and one scratched a rough map of part of Jupiter on the wall of our cell to show me where Zanor was located. "But much good it will do you to know," he said. "One can never tell," I replied. They had told me what I was to expect at the graduating exercises, and I gave the subject considerable thought. I did not purpose attending a Morgor commencement in the role of a willing sacrifice. "How many of you men are expert swordsmen?" I asked. About half of them claimed to be, but it is a failing of fighting men to boast of their prowess. Not of all fighting men, but of many, usually those with the least to boast of. I wish that I had some means of determining which were really good. Of course, we can't get a hold of any swords, I said. But if we had some sticks about the length of swords, we could soon find out who were the best swordsmen among us. What good would that do us? Asked one. We can give those Morgors a run for their money, I said, and to make them pay for their own graduation. The slave who brings our food is from my country, said Hondu. I think he might smuggle a couple of sticks into us. He is a good fellow. I'll ask him when he comes. Pho Lar had said nothing about his swordsmanship. So, as he had proved himself a great boaster, I felt that he was not a swordsman at all. I was sorry, as he was by far the most powerful of all the Savator prisoners. And he was tall, too. With a little skill, he should have proved a most formidable swordsman. Hondu never boasted about anything, but he said that in his country, the men were much given to swordplay. And so I was counting on him. Finally, Hondu's compatriots smuggled in a couple of wooden rods about the length of a longsword, and I went to work to ascertain how my fellow prisoners stacked up as swordsmen. Most of them were good. A few were excellent. Hondu was magnificent, and, much to everyone's surprise, Pho Lar was superb. He gave me one of the most strenuous workouts I have ever had before I can touch him. It must have taken me nearly an hour to disarm him. He was one of the greatest swordsmen I have ever faced. Since our altercation upon my induction to their company, Pho Lar had kept much to himself. He seldom spoke, and I thought he might be brooding and planning on revenge. I had to find out just where he stood, as I could not take any chances of treachery or even half-hearted cooperation. I took Pho Lar aside after the passage with the wooden sticks. I put my cards squarely on the table. My plan, I said, requires as many good swordsmen as I can get. You are one of the finest I have ever met, but you may think that you have reason to dislike me, and therefore be unwilling to give me your full support. I cannot use any man who will not follow me and obey me, even to death. How about it? I will follow wherever you lead, he said. Here's my hand on it, if you will take my hand in friendship. I am glad to do it. As we grasped hands, he said, If I had known a man like you years ago, I should not have been the fool that I have been. You may count on me to my last drop of blood. And before you and I die, we shall have shown the Morgors something that they will never forget. They think that they are great swordsmen, but after they have seen you in action, they will have their doubts. I can scarcely wait for the time. I was impressed by Pho Lar's protestations. I felt that he was sincere, but I could not disabuse my mind of my first impression of him, that he was at heart an arrant coward. But perhaps, facing death, he would fight as a cornered rat fights. If he did, and didn't lose his head, he would wreak havoc on the Morgors. There were 20 of us in that cell. No longer did time drag heavily. It passed quickly in practice with our 2 wooden rods. Hondu, Pho Lar and I, acting as instructors, taught the others what tricks of swordsmanship we knew, until we were 20 excellent swordsmen. Several were outstanding. We discussed several plans of action. We knew that, if custom prevailed, we should be pitted against 40 young Morgor cadets striving to win to the warrior caste. We decided to fight in pairs, each of our 10 best swordsmen being paired with one of the 10 less proficient. But this pairing was to follow an initial charge by the first 10, with our teammates close behind us. We hoped thus to eliminate many of the Morgors in the first moments of the encounter, thus greatly reducing the odds against us. Perhaps we of the first 10 overestimate our prowess. Only time would tell. There was some nervousness among the prisoners, due, I think, to the uncertainty as to when we should be called upon to face those unequal odds. Each knew that some of us would die. If any survived, we had only rumor to substantiate our hope that they would be set free. And no man there trusted the Morgors. Every footfall in the corridor brought silence to the cell, with every eye fixed upon the door. At long last, our anxiety was relieved. A full company of warriors came to escort us to the field where we were to fight. I glanced quickly around at the prisoners' faces. Many were smiling, and there were sighs of relief. I felt greatly encouraged. We were taken to a rectangular field with tiers of seats on each of its 4 sides. The stands were crowded. Thousands of eyes stared from the hollow sockets of grinning skulls. It might have been a field day in hell. There was no sound. There were no bands. There were no flying flags, no color. We were given swords and herded together at one end of the field. An official gave us our instructions. When the cadets come onto the field at the far end, you will advance and engage them. That was all. And what of those of us who survived? I asked. None of you will survive, creature, he replied. We understand that those who survived will be given their freedom, I insisted. None of you will survive, he repeated. Would you like to place a little bet on that? None of your impudence, creature. The fellow was getting angry. But suppose one of us should survive, I demanded. In that case, his life would be spared, and he would be allowed to continue in slavery. But none has ever survived these exercises. The cadets are on the field, he cried. Go to your deaths, worms. To your stations, worms, I commanded. The prisoners laughed as they took their allotted positions. The first 10 in the front line, each with a partner behind him. I was near the center of the line. Handu and Pho Lar were on the flanks. We marched forward as we had practiced in our cell, all in step, the men in the rear rank giving the cadence by chanting, "Death to the Morgors," over and over. We kept intervals and distance a little greater than the length of an extended sword arm and sword. It was evident that the Morgors had never seen anything like that at a commencement exercise, for I could hear the hollow sound of their exclamations of surprise arising from the stands. And the cadets advancing to meet us were seemingly thrown into confusion. They were spread out in pairs in a line that extended almost all the way across the field. and it suddenly became a very ragged line. When we were about 25 feet from this line, I gave the command, "Charge!" We 10, hitting the center of their line, had no odds against us. The Morgors had spread their line too thin. They saw swordsmanship in those first few seconds, such as I'll warrant no Morgor ever saw before. 10 Morgors lay dead or dying on the field, as 5 of our first 10 wheeled toward the right, followed by our partners, and our remaining 10 men wheeled to the left. As we had not lost a man in the first onslaught, each 10 was now pitted against 15 of the enemy. The odds were not so heavily against us. Taking each half of the Morgor line on its flank, as we now were, gave us a great advantage, and we took heavy toll of them before those on the far flanks could get into the action, with the result that we were presently fighting on an almost even footing, our partners having now come into action. The Morgors fought with fanatic determination. Many of them were splendid swordsmen, but none of them was a match for any of our first 10. I caught an occasional glimpse of Pho Lar. He was magnificent. I doubt that any swordsman of any of the 3 worlds upon which I had fought could have touched Pho Lar, Hondu, or me with his point. But there were 7 more of us here, almost as good. Within 15 minutes of the start of the engagement, all that remained was the mopping up of the surviving Morgors. We had lost 10 men, all of the first 10 swordsmen having survived. As the last of the Morgors fell, one could almost feel the deathly silence that had settled upon the audience. The 9 gathered around me. "What now?" asked Pho Lar. "How many of you want to go back to slavery?" I asked. "No!" shouted 9 voices. "We are the 10 best swords on Erebus," I said. "We could fight our way out of the city. You men know the country beyond. What chance would we have to escape capture?" "There would be a chance," said Hondu. "Beyond the city, the jungle comes close. If we could make that, they would never find us." "Good," I said, and started at a trot toward a gate at one end of the field, the 9 at my heels. At the gateway, a handful of foolish guardsmen tried to stop us. We left them behind us, dead. Now we heard angry shouts arising from the field we had left, and we guessed that soon we would have hundreds of Morgors in pursuit. "Who knows the way to the nearest gate?" I demanded. "I do," said one of the companions. "Follow me," and he set off at a run. As we raced through the avenues of the drear city, the angry shouts of our pursuers followed us, but we held our distance and at last arrived at one of the city gates. Here again we were confronted by armed warriors who compelled us to put up a stiff battle. The cries of the pursuing Morgors grew louder and louder. Soon, all that we had gained would be lost. This must not be! I called Pho Lar and Hondu to my side, and ordered the remaining 7 to give us room. For the gateway was too narrow for 10 men to wield their blades within it advantageously. "This time we go through!" I shouted to my 2 companions as we rushed the surviving guardsmen. And we went through. They hadn't a chance against the 3 best swordsmen of 3 worlds. Miraculously as it may seem, all 10 of us won to freedom, with nothing more than a few superficial scratches to indicate that we had been in a fight. But the howling Morgors were now close on our heels. If there is anything in the three worlds that I hate, it is to run from a foe. But it would have been utterly stupid to have permitted several hundred angry Morgors to have overtaken me. I ran. The Morgors gave up the chase before we reached the jungle. Evidently, they had other plans for capturing us. We did not stop until we were far into the tropical verdure of a great forest. Then we paused to discuss the future and to rest. And we needed rest. That forest! I almost hesitate to describe it. So weird, so unearthly was it. Almost wholly deprived of sunlight, the foliage was pale. Pale with a death-like pallor, tinged with rose where the reflected light of the fiery volcanoes filtered through. But this was by far its least uncanny aspect. The limbs of the trees moved like living things. They writhed and twined, myriad, snake-like things. I had scarcely noticed them until we halted. Suddenly one dropped down and wrapped itself about me. Smiling, I sought to disentwine it. I stopped smiling. I was as helpless as a babe encircled by the trunk of an elephant. The thing started to lift me from the ground, and just then Handu saw and leapt forward with drawn sword. He grasped one of my legs, and at the same time sprang upward and struck the keen edge of his blade, severing the limb that had seized me. We dropped to the ground together. "What the devil?" I exclaimed. "What is it, and why did it do that?" Handu pointed up. I looked. Above me, at the end of a strong stem, was a huge blossom. A horrible thing. In its center was a large mouth armed with many teeth. And above the mouth were two staring, lidless eyes. "I had forgotten," said Handu, "that you are not of Erebus. Perhaps you have no such trees as these in your world." "We certainly have not," I assured him. "A few that eat insects, perhaps, like Venus's flytrap, but no man-eaters. You must always be on your guard when in one of our forests," he warned me. "These trees are living, carnivorous animals. They have a nervous system and a brain, and it is generally believed that they have a language and talk with one another." Just then, a hideous scream broke from above us. I looked up, expecting to see some strange Jupiterian beast above me. But there was nothing but the writhing limbs and the staring eyes of the great blossoms of the man-trees. Handu laughed. "Their nervous systems are of a low order," he said, "and the reactions correspondingly slow and sluggish. It took all this time for the pain of my sword cut to reach the brain of the blossom to which the limb belongs. A man's life would never be safe for a moment in such a forest," I commented. "One has to be constantly on guard," admitted Handu. "If you ever have to sleep out in the woods, build a smudge. The blossoms don't like smoke. They close up, and then they cannot see to attack you. But be sure that you don't oversleep your smudge." Vegetable life on Jupiter, practically devoid of sunlight, has developed along entirely different lines from that on Earth. Nearly all of it has some animal attributes, and nearly all of it is carnivorous. The smaller plants devouring insects, the larger, in turn, depending upon the larger animals for sustenance, on up to the man-eaters such as I had encountered, and those which Hondu said caught and devoured even the hugest animals that exist upon this strange planet. We posted a couple of guards, who also kept smudges burning, and the rest of us lay down to sleep. One of the men had a chronometer, and this was used to inform the men on guard when to awaken their reliefs. In this way, we all took turns watching and sleeping. When all had slept, the smudges were allowed to burn more brightly. The men cut limbs from the living trees, sliced them, and roasted them. They tasted much like veal. Then we talked over our plans for the future. It was decided that we should split up into parties of 2 or 3 and scatter, so that some of us might at least have a chance to escape recapture. They said that the Morgors would hunt us down for a long time. I felt that we would be much safer remaining together, as we were 10 undefeatable sword arms. But as the countries from which my companions came were widely scattered, and, as naturally, each wished, if possible, to return to his own home, it was necessary that we separate. It chanced that Hondu's country lay in the general direction of Zanor, as did Pho Lar's. So we 3 bid goodbye to the others and left them. How I was to reach faraway Zanor on a planet of 23 billion square miles of area, I was at some loss to conceive. So was Hondu. He told me that I would be welcome in his country if we were fortunate enough to reach it. But I assured him that I should never cease to search for Zanor and my mate. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. To Zanor. I shall not bore you with an account of that part of my odyssey, which finally brought me to one of the cities of Hondu's country. We kept as much to cover as we could, since we knew that if Morgors were searching for us, they would be flying low in invisible ships. Forests offered us our best protection from discovery, but there were wide plains to cross, rivers to swim, mountains to climb. In this world without night, it was difficult to keep account of time. But it seemed to me that we must have traveled for months. Pho Lar remained with us for a great deal of the time, but finally he had to turn away in the direction of his own country. We were sorry to lose him, as he had developed into a splendid companion, and we should miss his sword too. We had met no men, but had had several encounters with wild beasts, creatures of hideous, unearthly appearance, both powerful and voracious. I soon realized the inadequacy of our swords as a sole means of defense. So we fashioned spears of a bamboo-like growth that seemed wholly vegetable. I also taught Hondu and Pho Lar how to make bows and arrows, and to use them. We found them of great advantage in our hunting of smaller animals and birds for food. In the forests, we subsisted almost wholly on the meat of the man-tree. At last, Hondu and I came within sight of an ocean. "We are home," he said. "My city lies close beside the sea." I saw no city. We had come down out of some low hills and were walking across a narrow coastal plain. Hondu was several yards to my right when I suddenly bumped into something solid. Solid as a brick wall. But there was nothing there. The sudden collision had caused me to step back. I stretched out my hands and felt what seemed to be a solid wall barring my way. yet only a level expanse of bare ground. But the ground was not entirely bare. It was dotted, here and there, with strange plants, a simple leafless stalk, a foot or two tall, bearing a single fuzzy blossom at its top. I looked around for Hondu. He had disappeared. He had just vanished like a punctured soap bubble. All up and down the shore, there was no place into which he could have vanished. Nothing behind which he would have hidden. No hole in the ground into which he might have darted. I was baffled. I scratched my head in perplexity as I started on again toward the beach, only to once more bump into the wall that was not there. I put my hands against the invisible wall and followed it. It curved away from me. Foot by foot, I pursued my tantalizing investigation. After a while, I was back right where I had started from. It seemed I had run into an invisible tower of solid air. I started off in a new direction toward the beach, avoiding the obstacle which had obstructed my way. After a dozen paces, I ran into another. Then I gave up, at least temporarily. Presently, I called Hondu's name aloud, and almost instantly he appeared a short distance from me. "What kind of game is this?" I demanded. "I bump into a wall of solid air, and when I look for you, you are not anywhere. You have disappeared." Hondu laughed. "I keep forgetting that you are a stranger in this world," he said. "We have come to the city in which I live. I just stepped into my home to greet my family. That is why you cannot see me." And as he spoke, a woman appeared beside him, and a little child. They seemed to materialize out of thin air. Had I come to a land of disembodied spirits who had the power to materialize? I could scarcely believe it, as there was nothing ghostly nor ethereal about Hondu. "This is O Allah, my mate," said Hondu. "O Allah, this is John Carter, Prince of Helium. To him we owe my escape from the Morgors." O Allah extended her hand to me. It was a firm, warm hand of flesh and blood. "Welcome, John Carter," she said. "All that we have is yours." It was a sweet gesture of hospitality, but as I looked around, I could not see that they had anything. "Where is the city?" I asked. They both laughed. "Come with us," said O Allah. She led the way, apparently around an invisible corner. And there, before me, I saw an open doorway in thin air. Through the doorway, I could see the interior of a room. "Come in," invited O Allah. Then I followed her into a commodious circular apartment. Hondu followed and closed the door. The roof of the apartment was a dome, perhaps 20 feet high at its center. It was divided into 4 rooms by sliding hangings, which could be closed or drawn back against the wall. "Why couldn't I see the house from the outside?" I asked. "It is plastered on the outside with sands of invisibility, which we find in great quantity along the beach," explained Hondu. "It is about our only protection against the Morgors. Every house in the city is thus protected, a little over 500 of them. So I had walked into a city of 500 houses and seen only an expanse of open beach beside a restless sea." "But where are the people?" I asked. "Are they, too, invisible?" "Those who are not away hunting or fishing are in their homes," explained O Allah. we do not venture out any more than is necessary, lest Morgors be cruising around in their invisible ships and see us, thus discovering our city. If any of us should be thus caught out, said Handu, he must run away from the city as fast as he can. For if he entered a house, the Morgors would immediately know that there was a city here. It is a sacrifice that each of us is honor-bound to make for the safety of all. For he who runs is almost invariably caught and carried away, unless he chooses to fight and die. Tell me, I said to Handu, how in the world you found your house, when you could not see it or any other house. You noticed the impala plants growing throughout the city? He asked. I noticed some plants, but I saw no city. They both laughed again. We are so accustomed to it that it does not seem at all strange to us, said Pho Lar. But I can understand that it might prove very confusing to a stranger. You see, each plant marks the location of a house. By long experience, each of us has learned the exact location of every house in the city in relation to every other house. I remained for what may have been 5 or 6 days of Earth time in the home of Handu and Pho Lar. I met many of their friends, all of whom were gracious and helpful to me in every way that they could be. I was furnished with maps of considerable areas of the planet, parts of which, I was told, were still unexplored even by the Morgors. Of greatest value to me was the fact that Zanor appeared on one of the maps, which also showed a vast ocean lay between me and the country in which I believed the Savators to be. How I was to cross this ocean, neither I nor my newfound friends could offer a suggestion, other than the rather mad scheme I envisioned of building a sailboat and trusting myself to the map caprices of an unknown sea, perhaps swarming with dangerous reptiles. But this, I at last decided, was the only hope I had for being again reunited with my princess. There was a forest several miles along the coast from the city, where I might hope to find trees suitable for the construction of my craft. My friends tried their best to dissuade me, but when they found that I was determined to carry out my plan, they loaned me tools. And a dozen of them volunteered to accompany me to the forest and help me build my boat. At last, all was in readiness, and accompanied by my volunteer helpers, I stepped from the house of Handu to start the short march to the forest. Scarcely were we in the open when one of my companions cried, "Morgors!" Whereupon the Savators scattered in all directions away from their city. "Run, John Carter!" shouted Handu. But I did not run. A few yards distant, I saw the open doorway in the side of an invisible ship, and I saw 6 or 7 Morgors emerge from it. 2 rushed toward me. The others scattered in pursuit of the Savators. In that instant, a new plan flashed across my mind. Hope, almost extinct, leapt to life again. I whipped my sword from its scabbard and leapt forward to meet the first of the oncoming Morgors, thanking God that there were only 2 of them, as delay might easily wreck my hopes. There was no finesse in my attack. It was stark, brutal murder. But my conscience did not bother me as I drew my sword from the heart of the first Morgor and faced the second. The second fellow gave me a little more trouble, as he had been forewarned by the fate of his companion. And, too, he presently recognized me. That made him doubly wary. He commenced to howl to the others who were pursuing the Savators to come back and help him. bellowing that here was the creature from Garibus who had led the slaughter at the graduating exercises. From the corner of an eye, I saw that two of them had heard and were returning. I must hurry. The fellow now fought wholly on the defensive in order to gain time for the others to join him. I had no mind to permit this, and I pressed him hard, often laying myself wide open. A grey swordsman could have killed me easily. At last I reached him with a mighty cut that almost severed his head from his body. Then, with only a quick glance behind me to see how close the others were, I leapt toward the open doorway of the otherwise invisible ship, a Morgor close upon my heels. With naked blade still in my hand, I sprang aboard and closed the door behind me. Then I wheeled to face whatever of their fellows had been left aboard to guard the craft. The fools had left no one. I had the ship all to myself. And as I ran to the controls, I heard the Morgors beating upon the door, angrily demanding that I open it. They must have taken me for a fool, too. A moment later, the ship arose into the air, and I was away upon one of the strangest adventures of my life, navigating an unknown planet in an invisible craft. And I had much to learn about the navigation of Jupiter. By watching Vorian, I had learned how to start and stop a Morgor ship, how to gain or lose altitude, and how to cloak the ship in invisibility. But the instruments upon the panel before me were all entirely meaningless to me. The hieroglyphs of the Morgors were quite unintelligible. I had to work it all out for myself. Opening all the ports, I had a clear field of vision. I could see the shore I had just left, and I knew the direction of the coastline. Handu had explained this to me. It ran due north and south at that point. The ocean lay to the west of it. I found an instrument that might easily have been a compass. When I altered the course of the ship, I saw that it was a compass. I now had my bearings as closely as it was possible for me to get them. I consulted my map and discovered that Zanor lay almost exactly southeast. So out across the vast expanse of ocean, I turned the prow of my ship. I was free. I had escaped the Morgors unharmed. In Zanor, Dejathoris was safe among friends. That I should be with her, I had no doubt. We had experienced another amazing adventure. Soon we should be reunited. I had not the slightest doubt of my ability to find Zanor. Perhaps it is because I am always so sure of myself that I so often accomplish the seemingly impossible. How long I was crossing that dismal ocean, I do not know. With Jupiter whirling on its axis nearly 3 times as fast as Earth, and with no sun, moon, nor stars, I could not measure time. I saw no ship upon that entire vast expanse of water, but I did see life. Plenty of it. And I saw terrific storms that buffeted my craft, tossing it about like a feather. But that was nothing compared with what I saw below me as the storms at the height of their fury lashed the surface of the waters. I realized then how suicidal would have been my attempt to cross that terrible ocean in the frail craft that I had planned to build. I saw waves that must have measured 200 feet from trough to crest. Waves that hurtled the mighty monsters of the deep as though they had been tiny minnows. No ship could have lived in such seas. I realized then why I saw no shipping on this great Jupiterian ocean. But at last, I sighted land ahead. And what land? Xandar had told me of the mighty mountains of Zanor, rearing their forested heads 20 miles above the level of the sea. and it was such mountains that lay ahead of me. If I had reckoned accurately, this should be Zanor, and these breathtaking mountains assured me that I had not gone wrong. I knew from Xandar's explanation just where to search for the stamping grounds of his tribe, a wild mountain tribe of fighting men. They lay in a land of meadows and ravines on the east slope of the highest mountain, and at an altitude of only about 10 miles, or about halfway to the summit. Here, the air is only slightly thinner than at sea level, as the cloud envelope retains the atmosphere of Jupiter as though it were held in a bag, permitting none of it to escape, while the rapid revolution of the planet tends to throw the atmosphere far up from the surface. Most fortunate was I in coming upon the village of Xandar with little or no difficulty. Entirely invisible, I hovered above it, dropping down slowly. I knew that the moment that they saw a Morgor ship, they would disappear into the forest that surrounded the village, waiting there to rush upon any Morgors who might be foolish enough to leave the ship after landing. There were people in plain view of me in the village as I dropped within 50 feet of the ground. I stopped the ship and hung there. Then I demagnetized the hull. And as the ship became instantly visible, I leapt to the door and pushed it open, so that they can see I was no Morgor. I waved to them and shouted that I was a friend of Xandar, and asked permission to land. They called to me to do so, and I brought the ship slowly toward the ground. My lonely voyage was over. I had surmounted seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and I had reached my goal. Soon my incomparable Deja-Thors would be again in my arms. End of Chapter 9. The End of the Skeleton Men of Jupiter by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Read by Joe DeNoia, Chesterfield, New Jersey, May 2nd, 2024.